was fairly like radical as a young man, but like, I spent most of my adult life somewhere in the bottom of the bottle and didn't really pay attention to politics all that much. And I was sort of starting to come back into that right around that. And that was the moment for me where I saw. Um, I actually remember I was in an EMS station, and it was there was a police station like across the street, and I was watching on the news people in my city on that first night like rioting, and I was looking out the window at um, the parking lot at police station being filled up with like a SWAT MRAP and like buses filled with like National Guard people. And like it just kind of clicked in my head. It was like that line that Orwell quote where Orwell has his problems, but like I always remember this line where he said, whenever I see a policeman hassling a worker, there's never any question in my head whose side I'm on. And like I remember like all the people around me were like talking about how much they were looking forward to, those people on the TV rioting, getting what was coming to them from the people across the street. And I just like instantly I was like, I know whose side I'm on, and it's not anybody here. And that was a very like formative experience for me, even as like a relatively grown man. It just kind of like just all like the like scales fell from my eyes on the way to Damascus, and I was just like, oh, okay, I remember who I am, and I had to do something about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who come into the racism discussion group with similar stories. There was one guy in particular one of the early members, he doesn't really come anymore, but he was part of a conversation at town hall about Confederate statues, and the way he described it, I could just imagine him like swiveling his head back and forth as people stood up talking about different things, just being like, "What? Where am I?" Like he was shocked at what he was hearing. And these are his colleagues; these are people he's known. And he was just like, "What are you saying right now?" And that's why it tickles me, when people try to say that. Racism is so mysterious, man, and elusive. It's very difficult for a lot of people to perceive. But who is not difficult for us to perceive? Is Black people, because we experience it a lot. So we are better at perceiving it. It's something that I have a really hard time with. I kind of talked to you a little bit about it during our last conversation, but like, getting people to understand that, like, just like anything you practice, right, you're going to get better at it. Anything that you're continuing to, like, engage in, especially if it's tied to your survival, right? I think that's another thing that people discount about Black people's perception of racism is that, it can kill us, like, literally, pretty easily, actually. And so, we've learned a lot about how to deal with a toxic racial environment. And it's just unfortunate that, what we've learned has been turned into a negative tagline of lived experience, something to be discounted and ridiculed.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully that was, hopefully we're able to get through to people. It's actually funny that you're talking about like the Confederate statues, because I remember I was so there was one of those where I live, and it got removed not by an action of the city council, and I may or may not know people who participated in its removal as a bit of community service. And the following day, I was working on an ambulance, and I got staged at the site where they were like finally like the city was like, well, I guess we got to get rid of it now, and they took it down. And my partner was somebody whose wife was in the Daughters of the Confederacy, and so he parked the ambulance so that we were facing away from the the statue, so he couldn't see it get removed completely. And I just got out of the truck and like was just kind of like sitting on the back seat and just like watching it. And I was like, just completely different reactions to that event.
So funny, man. That's hilarious. Yeah, man. I try to be empathetic. I try to think about somebody who would want to preserve that statue, but it's just really hard. It's just I don't know what I'm supposed to be feeling empathy for. Like what? Like for what? Like I actually can't even think of something,
Well, I think a lot of people who, so like, I mean, there's like racist people want it, those things there for obvious reasons, but like, I think a lot of like liberals are just kind of like reflexively like free speech and we shouldn't destroy history and like all that shit, and they don't ever really think about it. And like to a certain extent I kind of agree with the feeling that is the impulse for that. Like we should never demolish Auschwitz, right? Auschwitz, the concentration camp. We should never demolish that. It should always be there as a monument to the horrible things that human beings are capable of and the people who lost their lives there. That doesn't apply to a statue that was built in 1929 by the Klan. Like it's a different thing. It's categorically a different thing. And I think there's just a lot of like cognitive dissonance and people just being unreflective. Like they repeat the last thing that sounded good that somebody said, like if you're listening to Sam Harris or
it doesn't
like
sound good to me,
Yeah. Well, so like if you're listening to somebody who makes it sound good, like we need to preserve history as a reminder that we never, like that I could make a case for why that statue would be there if I really were pressed to.
Cut it down, Mark. I'd cut it down so fast.
I wouldn't agree with the case, but I could make one that would be appealing to liberals. And so I do have a little bit of empathy for those people, just because I think that most people walk through life, most white people walk through life politically just kind of with their head in the clouds, and they're not really thinking very deeply about
you didn't even have to say
things.
Politically. You could cut out all the qualifiers and just say most people are walking around not thinking very deeply, and I would have been like, I agree.
Yeah,
I mean that's what's going on, and that's exactly why we're in the situation we're in, and that's why things are going to get worse. It's because people are not thinking. They're being fed what to think, and they're lapping it up.
Yep. So just got to make better food.
I know. I'm trying to make better food, man. I'm trying to make something nourishing that people can really sink their teeth into. Thanks for watching. For access to the full-length conversation and all of the 2-hour-long unedited conversations that I've had on race, click the support link in the description below. Thanks for your support, and see you next time.